Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Oh, I like call and response. It's very good. Sorry. Wait. I have to fix my bow tie. This is very important. There we go. Now we can get underway. I'm Troy McKenzie, and I have the privilege of being Dean of NYU School of Law, and I cannot tell you how delighted I am to see so many people here for the launch of the NYU Environmental Justice Initiative. Yes. We are joined this evening by faculty, students, alumni, and other partners from across the university and well beyond. And I want to thank everyone for all of the work you have done to get us here this evening and the work that will continue beyond this evening. Let me begin with my deepest gratitude to the Napolis, to Marie and Paul Napoli. They will remember a delightful conversation we had over breakfast probably a year and a half ago now, 2 years ago. It was probably 2 years ago when this was a glint in the eye, and here we are today. And without their commitment and support, and I mean support in every dimension, thought, partnership, passion, compassion, we would not be here. So I really, really want to thank you. And I also want to thank those who have worked across different agencies, parts of the university, advocacy organizations, and here within the law school to help us get here tonight. And along those lines, special thanks to my colleagues, Professor Katrina Wyman and Professor Vincent Sutherland, and their teams at the Guarini Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law, and the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law. This has been, within the law school, a deep partnership as well. And of course, I want to acknowledge our amazing director of the Environmental Justice Initiative, Marian Engelman-Lado. Who has worked tirelessly since coming to NYU to get this off the ground. I just want to speak briefly about what we're doing this evening and what this Environmental Justice Initiative is all about. We begin with a simple but extremely urgent premise, which is that environmental and climate justice are inseparable from racial and economic justice. That is the core truth that inspires all of our work. Across this country, around the world, we see that low-income communities and communities of color bear disproportionate burdens of environmental harm, whether polluted air and water, or the devastating effects of climate change. Addressing all of these inequities requires a range of approaches and a broad toolkit. Legal and policy tools that will bridge environmental sustainability with social and racial equity. So the goal is to have this initiative serve as a hub for research, for teaching, for advocacy, all aimed at ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, race, income, zip code, has access to clean air, clean water, and a safe and healthy place to live and raise a family. And I think all of that is deeply ingrained in our mission at NYU Law, to use the law, to study, and to see the law as a force for good, for equity, for accountability, and for opportunity. Most importantly, this represents what happens when members of our extraordinary community here at the law school and across the university and beyond, faculty, alumni, students, partners, come together to confront urgent challenges in practical, collaborative, and deeply thoughtful ways. I will now turn things over to Marian, but before I do, I just want to say that I could not be prouder that we are launching this work. Again, I want to thank the Napoles for their generosity and for their steadfast commitment. And I want to thank all of you for being here this evening, because I never have to worry whether a new initiative has found its place and sparked deep interest and passion to drive it forward when I look around a room and I see all of you here. So thank you and congratulations.
Thank you to the Dean for those remarks and for being here and for his leadership. Many thanks. Good evening. Good evening. One more time. Good evening.
Good evening.
There you go. Welcome to all of you who have joined us to launch the new Environmental Justice Initiative at NYU School of Law. I want to also express appreciation to Vincent Sutherland and to Katrina Wyman, the faculty directors of the Center for Race and Equality in the Law, CRIL, and the Guarini Center for Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law, respectively, who came together to create the Environmental Justice Initiative. The initiative is intended, as we just heard, to address the vast, enduring, and unconscionable disparities, and particularly racial disparities, in the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, and to support communities fighting to have a say in their health and the future of their environment, to provide legal support to groups that imagine a time when race, national origin, and income are no longer the best predictors of whether a child is exposed to pollution in the United States, and taking action to make this vision a reality. We can all agree that a person's race, national origin, income, tribal affiliation, or disability should not determine whether they are exposed to more pollution, whether they have access to parks and green space, or whether they survive a flood or wildfire. As Dr. Martin Luther King said in his Christmas sermon in 1967, it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all. Environmental and climate justice are not zero-sum games. They call on us to create a world that is sustainable for all, and a world where all people are treated with respect and dignity. I can imagine no time when this additional capacity for this critical work would be more needed. And we benefit from the relationship with centers dedicated to dismantling structural and particularly racial inequality and building a sustainable and equitable economy. Again, many thanks to Vincent and Katrina. Can you just raise your hands, everybody? Katrina's may not have been possible, but she's over there in the purple. Little low. Thanks also to Paul and Marie Napoli and the Napoli family who are here. I'm so excited to see you, and whose support made the initiative and the launch tonight possible. I've gotten to know Paul and Marie over the last few months, and am truly grateful for their steadfast support. I'm excited to see so many friends, colleagues, partners, and client organizations in the room. For those of you who don't know me, you can read my bio. Along with the bios of our panelists tonight, because I'm not going to do them justice. But I am a civil rights lawyer and a community-based environmental justice lawyer who left nonprofit legal practice and clinical education to join the Biden administration in 2021. And let me tell you, that was a leap of faith. I brought with me to the administration the struggles and the voices of the people and groups I had represented over the years, from New York to Alabama to California, as well as a keen sense that I couldn't speak for them, they had to speak for themselves. As I left the administration on June 20th of this year with so much left to do, I was still thrilled to join Katrina, Vince, and the NYU community to launch this initiative. And we hit the ground running. I want to ask my research assistants and members of the lab this semester and those who have signed up for the spring lab to stand up for a sec. Get some energy going here. We were oversubscribed, which is terrific. There were more students that wanted to be in the lab than we could take, and I hope they can, if they were second years, that they can take the lab next year. And there are such wonderful students at NYU. These inaugural classes, though, are extraordinary. And I wanted them to stand because I hope the rest of you have a chance to talk to them during the reception following our program, to hear about their work and why they joined the lab. Given this moment in history, we have 4 initial priorities, and I'll just be really quick with them. First, the legal defense of community-based environmental justice groups that now are facing harassment and attack. They face the termination of grants by the Trump administration, competitive grants that they won fairly to develop heat pump programs or community climate centers or address coastal erosion. We have a student team now working to counsel a group dealing with just the chaos of this administration, not just the loss of funds, but also utter chaos. Second, we're defending and enforcing civil rights. We hit the ground running with comments on the administration's effort to weaken civil rights standards, and our work together with some of the partners in this room, Aubrey, caused the administration at least to delay weakening the rules. Got to celebrate where we can. We can't watch on the sidelines as the administration warps the meaning and application of civil rights laws. And those laws were hard fought and stand for fairness and justice. 3, representing communities in what is often called place-based work. Our students are representing one community, just to give one example, that recently learned that the parks where their children played, and many of them played as little kids, are contaminated with lead. It turns out that these parks were created in locations where the city had run incinerators during the time of segregation between 1937 and 1950. Community members have questions. They want a safe place for their children to play, and they want an adequate cleanup. That's just fair. Finally, partnering with communities advocating for stronger state environmental justice laws. And some of the leaders in that effort in New York and New Jersey are in the room, although I think Ana Batista had to leave early, so apologies to Ana. But I'd like those who have helped to develop the New York and New Jersey laws to raise your hands, and that includes you, Lisa. Raise your hands so people can acknowledge the great work you've done. In the back. Our students are wrestling with what it means to be a community lawyer, to be a partner, an ally, and to represent communities, to use legal tools to support community movements. The theory of community lawyering is from the ground up, and I see Sheila Foster here, who wrote the book From the Ground Up, where lawyers support rather than supplant community agency and leadership. And we'll be talking about these ideas tonight. I'm truly thrilled that Charles Lee, Vernice Miller-Travis, and Aubrey Connor could be here. We have a star-studded lineup for you. Please, again, read their bios, both the short bios we've provided and also information online. You have homework for tonight. This is a school, after all. We have heroes and sheroes of the environmental and climate justice movement with us, and honestly, they're people I love and admire. I said that to Charles earlier today, and it's true. Charles and Vernice were among the co-founders of the environmental justice movement. There is no single founder. There are many co-founders. They were among the co-founders of the environmental justice movement.
They're here.
In the 1980s, they're visionary authors of the 1987 seminal Toxic Waste and Race, a report that not only shed light on the relationship between race and the placement of hazardous and toxic sites, but also gave rise to an expansive literature, a whole field of study, and made recommendations that shaped the movement, including the call for an executive order on environmental justice, which President Clinton signed a few years later. Of course, it's been rescinded, but we still have it, and their work did not stop there. Today, they're at the center of efforts to strengthen state environmental justice laws, to take the cumulative impacts of multiple sources of pollution into account, to fight for civil rights protections, and I'm looking at you, Vernice, and so much more. Aubrey Connor is the director of the NAACP's Center for Environmental and Climate Justice and is a moving force on critical issues such as the impact of data centers in already environmentally overburdened communities of color. I'm simply not going to do these panelists justice in this introduction, but let me just say I am inspired by you all every day. Just a word about the format before we jump in. We'll be having a conversation, and then we'll leave time for Q&A before heading to our reception. If time permits, this is one of the few times where sometimes people are eager to get the food and drink. You're going to be sorry when we say, time's up, we got to go get the food and drink. If time permits, we will circulate a microphone, but I also encourage you to write your questions down on the index cards we provided. Our incredible fellows, stand up for a sec so everyone can see who you are. They're going to collect these cards before Q&A and during Q&A, and we will try to get to your questions. If you have a card and you want them to have it, just raise your hands. Okay, so I'm going to come join you right now, and we'll get started. And I encourage everyone to use your microphones. Is mine on? Is it on? Okay. Use your microphones, and when we get to Q&A, wait for a microphone because we do want to make sure everybody can hear. So, Charles, my first question is for you. And sorry to have my back to you. I'm going to look at Charles. Okay. My first question is for you. I know you can write a book about this. But can you give us a sense of the origin of the environmental justice movement and the key principles of the movement that evolved from that origin? And that question could go on all night. So just a sense of it.
So, truth be told, Marion asked me 3 hours ago, well, how are you going to answer that question in 5 minutes? And I've been in a deep panic ever since. But I came up with a way. So I think I would start with the fact that when some of us started working on this issue, it didn't have a name. And today, it permeates all aspects of life in not just the United States, but across the world. And, you can see that in terms of the numbers of universities that have environmental justice courses. That's hundreds of them. Or the thousands of peer-reviewed journal articles, and you can go on and on about that. So that's, I think that's one thing. The second is that at the point when I got to work, I went to Warren County and participated in the protest there in 1982, and it was my good fortune to meet people like Dr. Ben Chavis and others at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice who hired me to work on a national project on environmental environmental harms and justice. And so I went around the country first, just researching all the issues, and I was astounded by the breadth and depth and persistence of all the types of environmental injustice that exist. And I won't name them all, but I got this idea that we need to put this issue on the map. And so that's what led to Toxic Waste and Race. I don't think so it's not enough time to go through all the steps there, but I think to sum it up, it would be that we were able to bring data to bear to show that the multiple examples of environmental injustice were not just isolated examples. They were part of a systemic issue. And so in some ways, we visualized the issue. We visualized the idea that there was a disproportionate, inequitable distribution of environmental harms and burdens. It's kind of like Ida B. Wells. Everybody knows who Ida B. Wells is. She's a journalist. in the 1890s, civil rights activist. She mapped where lynchings were taking place and showed that they were not isolated or part of a systemic issue. So that's so I think that's what, and I think Vernice and others would tell you the kind of impact it had in many, many, many individual communities. So the third way I would answer that question is, you know, Marion said this already. One of the key tenets of environmental justice is that communities speak for themselves, and that what that means is that perhaps some of the best solutions are in those communities. So this is the story of Warren County when I got there in 1982. And among the conversations I had were with residents who said that, you know, this is, they were citing a hazardous waste landfill in Warren County, and they were thinking about, they heard about a hazardous waste landfill in a place called Email, Alabama. And that's chemical waste management's facility there. Well, Email, Alabama is in the heart of the Alabama Black Belt. And so we had this conversation then about, you know, if you were to take that there, you're just putting in another community just like yours. Fast forward a dozen years, and the landfill leaches, the state has to figure out what to do with it. And so there was this conversation about what to do. And, you know, all the experts were saying we should just transport it somewhere else. But the community said, the advisory board that was set up, they said, no, they want to detoxify it on site. And why? Because they didn't want that to go to another community that looks just like them.
Charles, thank you. And I heard these themes of how community-driven this movement is and the importance of data as well. And I want to turn, before we get to the next question, Vernice and then Aubrey. Vernice, to you, Charles sort of set the stage with the seminal Toxic Waste and Race and how important that was. It's a game changer, as Charles, in your language. And then you were both at and had a pivotal role in the first People of Color National Environmental Summit, National Environmental People of Color Summit. Got those words wrong, but you get the idea.
First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. It's a mouthful.
Thank you. And I forgot the word leadership. Thank you, Vernice. So, and we're part of, and there are other people in this room, also part of the drafting of the principles of environmental justice, which are so fundamental, and both Charles and I are sort of borrowing from those principles. Can you just say a few words about that chapter and anything else you want to add quickly?
Sure. So, you know, as Charles said, it's not just that we're connected to community-based work. We are grounded in community-based work. And it's that work and those principles and those challenges that set the frame for what it is that we do and how we try to apply whatever expertise we have, whatever research we can bring to problem solving about what those problems are on the ground. And I'll just say one thing about that and then go directly to Marion's question. So when we were working on Toxic Waste and Race, I called my grandmother, who was a nurse. All her sisters were nurses. My mother was a nurse here in New York. And I told her, because the data that we were pulling forward, it was my job to collect the data from another data analytics firm that was working with us. It was my job to take that data and then map it across the United States. What does that look like, right? And this is before the advent of GIS. So you might think, oh, you could do that in a matter of minutes. Yeah, no, you can do it in 6 months if you're doing it by hand on a map, right? And so I called my grandmother and I told her what we were doing. And I said, Grandma, this is like astounding. The degree to which this data keeps coming up in every place. And her first question was, so how much did y'all spend on that study? And I said, I don't know, Grandma. I'm not in charge of the money, which was true. Charles was in charge of the money. I said, I don't know, 150,000, 250,000. And then she said, so y'all spent $250,000 on, she said, I'm going to assume it's from donations that people put in the collection plates to the United Church of Christ, and some of that money goes to the national church. I was like, yes, Grandma, that's how it works. And she said, so again, you spent $250,000 of people's hardworking money to tell you something that every black person in America knows to be true. And she sort of caught me short, right? And I'm like, damn, okay. So what do I say? And I said, well, that's true, Grandma. That's absolutely true. I said, but you're a nurse and you're a scientist and you know this. You could have all the lived experience in the world, but until somebody can create a data set about that, and that data set can be replicated again and again and again in other locations and have the same outcomes, then it's like we haven't had that lived experience, right? And so all we're doing is codifying people's lived experience, right? So that's what we did. And then we get to the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, and Charles's strategy of going around the country, him and an amazing, amazing organizer and theorist and EJ leader, Damu Smith, were going around the country, picking up these communities and asking them to come to the summit and come together. And then everybody gets in a room together, right? And there's hundreds of us. And for years, I thought it was 700 people. And a couple of years ago, Charles said, no, it was 1,100 people. I said, okay, I left out a few people. And we're all in this room together, and we're looking at each other, and we're saying, oh my God. Oh my God, I thought it was just me. I thought it was just my community in Northern Manhattan. I thought it was just us in West Harlem. I didn't know it was people all over New York City. I didn't know it was people all over New Jersey and everywhere else and everywhere else. And so we get together. Charles had set up this framework. Well, we need to come out of this with something concrete, right? So we had this draft, Principles of Environmental Justice. And true to form, it was very nice of Charles to do that, but we kicked that to the curb, right? And we started all over again. He gave us 6 to start with, and we wound up with 17. But our process was, to this day, the most extraordinary experience of democratic decision-making I have ever had the privilege of being a part of. And that's all 1,700 of those people, especially the delegates who were representatives of EJ communities, especially, debated every single word of every principle every freaking night, after dinner, after the cultural program, after the wine, right? And then we would debate every single word. And so by the third night, we're doing this for 4 freaking nights. By the third night, I'm exasperated. So I'm on the drafting committee, and I'm exasperated. And I said, look, you people, you do not have to go over every single word, right? We have the theories. We know what we're trying to say, and let's get this done before we leave here on Sunday. And a woman named Leah Wise, she ran an organization called Black Workers for Justice in Durham, North Carolina. And Leah gets up and Leah says, we got to get this perfect. Because when we come out of here, these principles are going to have to speak for us. That was 1991, right? And they debated every single word. Now, me, I'm a grammarian. Some of the sentences are not grammatically correct. And I want to go back and fix them. I've wanted to go back and fix them since 1991, but it's like the Old Testament. You can't touch it, right? You just can't touch it. You just got to live with it the way it is. And so, and there they are, right? And there they are. And they speak for themselves, and they still have resonance, and they still say what we want to say. I would add a few things. There's nothing in there about climate, because we weren't really focused on that issue at the time, but it speaks from our hearts about what we thought should be the principles and what a new environmental movement should speak to, one that looks at issues of race, one that looks at issues of class, of gender, of reproductive health, of the International Convention on Human Rights, right? All of that is in the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice, of indigenous land rights and sovereignty. We spoke to all of that. And they stand and they speak for themselves all these years later.
Aubrey, do you want to add anything? Thank you, Vernice. And any one of these questions we could just have the whole time for, right? You want to speak to that, or should we move to the present?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this conversation and for helping us all to ground the work from its inception to understand how it's still relevant to what we're facing today. Right? I hear some of the stories, and I talk a lot to Vernice and to Charles, and it's so interesting because now in a lot of the communities that we do work in at the NAACP, we have 2,200 units across the country, and some of these same patterns still show up because a lot of the issues are around power around who controls the resources, around who has the ability to speak for themselves. And so when we started to see the patterns with, for example, these data centers that have been popping up in communities across the country, but most recently, the one that really caught our attention that we realized, okay, we need to have a united front, was what was happening in Memphis, because we have this billionaire who decided, with all the money that he had, to go into a community that already has 4 times the cancer rates of all the communities across the country. Historically Black community in Boxtown, which is in South Memphis area, Tennessee, and a place that has been fighting industrial and environmental pollution for a number of years. And so for, XAI to start operating in that community, to have 66 unregulated gas turbines that were operating in this community when they obviously could have waited, number one, to get the permits, or to pay for a better operation that would not add to the existing pollution and environmental concerns that are in the community. We were seeing what we knew was going to be a trend for this era of environmental and climate justice work. When you have methane gas turbines that are already in places where there's existing pollution, we really don't, to Vernice's point, we don't need reports. But unfortunately, some of the same tactics that we've seen for a number of years of these companies going to people or to particular individuals within the community who they think will speak on their behalves, as opposed to talking to the community members themselves to try to buy them off or to promise them jobs or to say there's going to be a promise of jobs or things like that. Using those same tactics that we've seen in the past, but with the promise of research and technology and innovation that we knew that we needed to get involved in. So that was why we decided to, file the notice of intent to sue XAI for violating the law. The Clean Air Act is very clear, and they were violating it. You cannot run unregulated turbines, 66 of them, and think that you don't have to get any type of permits. And so from that, we also then decided, once the county decided to give them a permit, we decided to challenge that as well. But what we started to hear is similar to what Vernice and Charles talked about what happened in 1991. We started to hear from our units, from other people in different communities saying, we're facing similar problems across the country, and we're not sure how to approach this from a strategic front. And so we knew that because tech companies, a lot of them, they have a lot of money, they're able to move very quickly, that we needed to move in the moment. And we decided to pull together over 80 organization coalition partners, activists and organizers. I talked to Vernice about some of the steps of doing that. And we went to South Memphis and we did a convening at a HBCU there that was completely hybrid, to allow for people to come up with what is our frontline framework for how data center engagement and what the principles of engagement need to look like in communities. And what we based it on was the 17 principles of EJ, because we know that that is so important for what this work looks like, to ground those conversations, to ensure that people understand that at its base, what's happening in these communities are environmental and climate justice concerns. And we also had folks there from the media space, from labor unions, from housing spaces, because we also understand that this is a comprehensive approach to fighting back what environmental and climate justice concerns look like in communities.
Thanks so much, Aubrey. And you already anticipated and segued us from the past to the present. So thank you. That's where we were going. Excellent. I want to turn to Vernice for the second round. Can you tell us a little bit, as we think about the present, about, you just said that the one thing you would edit besides the grammar is inclusion of climate. And can you tell us a little bit about the origins of the climate justice movement and what you see as the challenges and opportunities at this incredibly, and this is a euphemism, chaotic and nerve-wracking moment in the nation's history?
Indeed. So there, in my opinion, is some confusion about whether climate justice is a separate set of issues from environmental justice. It is not. It is derivative of environmental justice. There's a framework, there's a foundation, there's a new set of challenges, okay, an avalanche of challenges coming at us worldwide, but also here in the US of A and in our hemisphere. And we have tried to catch up to meet the moment of these challenges. And so a lot of people have gravitated to this conversation around climate justice. It is a critically important conversation, but I want to put it in context. There are lots of communities across the United States who are especially vulnerable to the threats of climate change. But they are not vulnerable by accident. They are vulnerable by design, right? So one of the foundational things to understand about environmental justice and climate justice, then coming right on its heels, is that people live where they live, in the places that they live, not because they chose to live there, but because they were forced to live there, right? And many of those places were ecologically vulnerable from the beginning. In the South, they used to talk about the bottoms, right? It's a sort of euphemistic term for where a lot of Black people lived, in rural communities in particular. And people probably thought they were saying because they were the lowest of the low, economically, or from a political standpoint. That's true, but it was also low-lying areas, right? In flood zones, before we knew what a flood zone was, before there was a FEMA, long before there was a FEMA, before there was really an Army Corps of Engineers that worked at this level, people lived in ecologically vulnerable places by design, right? The barrios, also in floodplains, right? Public housing built, for the most part, in flood zones, right here in New York, Far Rockaway, right? It's not an accident. So when you get this now heated up environment because of all the usage of petrochemicals and the release of methane and the superheated atmosphere that we have, which is creating these climate conditions that we see, the places that were vulnerable to begin with, of course, are going to be even more vulnerable from the threats of climate change, right? We also see experiences like sunny day flooding. How many of y'all have experienced that? We have that in Annapolis, Maryland. I live 2 towns over from Annapolis, Maryland. We have that in Annapolis all the time. And every time it rains in Annapolis, Annapolis floods. Also known as the capital of the state of Maryland, also known as the home of the U.S. Naval Academy. You would think they would try to fix that, right? And for those of us who live in the Chesapeake Bay region, which includes 11 states, including parts of New York State, for us in Maryland and in D.C. and in Northern Virginia, we don't live near the Chesapeake Bay. We live inside the Chesapeake Bay, right? So everything that happens to the Bay happens to our communities. That's true in places all across the United States. So the vulnerability is not accidental. It's just like what we found in toxic waste and waste. It is by design. And if you want to unpack that, if you want to make communities safer, you got to go back to the source. And the source is residential segregation. The source is not being concerned about land use, right? And no place has perfected the incorporation of race and residential segregation into land use more thoroughly than the city of New York and the state of New York. We could teach people around the world how not to do land use, right? And I discovered that when we were doing work in Northern Manhattan for We Act for Environmental Justice, our fight against the North River Sewage Treatment Plant. And I kept trying to figure out, why did we keep ending up in the same position? And when I looked at it, the foundation of it was local land use and zoning here in New York. And so I decided I would look at that around the country. And again, just like toxic waste and race, it presented itself as the nexus of race and residential segregation and land use. In fact, I was in the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at Columbia really sort of working deeply on this, and I took a class on hazardous waste law with Michael Gerard, who helps to run the Climate Center in the Sabin Center at Columbia, and he was my professor. And when we got to the time we were going to write our papers, he asked me, well, maybe you should take another run at toxic waste and race. And I'm like, excuse me? And he said, you know, I'm just not sure that it still holds up. I said, Michael, that would be a great thing for you to tell your students to do. But we are never going back and visiting that again because it makes people uncomfortable. When you say that race is the animating factor, well, it is. Get over it, right? But don't lament it. Do something about it, right? Don't just keep perpetuating it decade after decade. Do something about it. And that's what you and your fellows and your students are going to do.
Yeah, thank you, Bernice. It's a small task, very small task. No heavy burden there. But we accept. And, you know, just to put a fine point on what you're saying, Bernice, in a less eloquent way, perhaps, you know, in New York, the Board of Estimates was held unconstitutional as violating one man, one vote. And of course, nobody ever, and the Board of Estimates did land use planning in New York, and nobody ever undid all of the zoning, undid which are the industrial uses, which are the residential uses. So as someone with a civil rights background, and those of you here with a civil rights background, you know that in school desegregation, for example, in Swan, et cetera, there was a command by the Supreme Court that we have to uproot that unconstitutional behavior root and branch, right? There was this mandate, not that it was ever done perfectly, not that we ever achieved equality in schooling, but there was a mandate. And in the area of land use, that was never done. So that footprint of segregation, of redlining, that footprint, that racial footprint in our land has never been uprooted, and it has a direct tie to Boxtown, which was an unincorporated area outside of Memphis, which was the African-American area outside of Memphis. It has a direct route to Harlem, to, you know, all these stories that we're talking about when you went across the world on your tour across the United States, Charles, so many of those situations have a direct relationship. So we can talk more about what's happening now, but I also want to turn to Aubrey, to you, to get us started on helping to envision the future. So we've talked a little bit about the past, talked a little bit about the present, which I'm sure we're going to continue talking about, but where do you see this work going? This question really has two parts. What's your vision for environmental and climate justice? Where should we be going? And what are the key areas of work? I mean, if you were going to advise us here at NYU as to what we should be working on, how do we get there? How do we get toward that vision?
Well, my vision for the future is to hope that all of us would be able to be in positions where we're not having to defend, and we're actually in a space where we can affirmatively feel like we can vision. So what's actually coming from the community that they're actually able to implement, and that we're not having to spend so much time defending what we already had. And so that's my hope for the future, is that we can get to that place, and that we can actually realize what many of the founders of the environmental and climate justice movement envision, which is our ability to eat, live, and pray in the community of your choice, and not have to move somewhere else because of climate-related decisions that you probably did not have anything to do with, but you have to bear the brunt of those decisions. And so, but what I think that is so important, and we've already, done some of this work, and I think that is so incredibly important, is that with an EJ initiative, as was highlighted earlier by the dean, is that EJ at its core is civil rights issues. And that's why at the NAACP, which is a civil rights organization, it is one of our priority areas. And we have a center on environmental and climate justice because we see that as highly connected to civil rights. And in the stories of what happened in Warren County, our branch was there, our state conference was there. highlighting that these were civil rights issues in Warren County, and NAACP has been there since the beginning of the environmental justice movement, amplifying this intersection because we see it as so incredibly important. And so right now we're in a place where we have an administration who's trying to roll back civil rights protections along with environmental and energy protections and all the work that has been done over decades. And so I think that it's important for this initiative to look at threading that needle, in academia more generally, but certainly at NYU, of helping to make sure that people see where those intersections show up. When we worked on the comments for the Department of Energy, one of the things that I felt was really important was that we were able to have folks from a lot of different spaces to sign on to be a part of those comments who typically would not look at a Department of Energy issue as being related to their work at all. But you all were very critical in highlighting for folks that this is a civil rights issue and that we're going to continue to see these kinds of threats if we don't fight back early and we don't fight back loudly, to ensure that folks understand that we are all unified within this space for what this work looks like moving forward. And then to highlight more poignantly some of the data center work that I started talking about earlier, the Frontline Framework really is an opportunity. It's a call to action for tech companies to engage in a way that comes from a community perspective, as opposed to what we were hearing from like some tech companies is, we don't know what the community wants, or even certain agencies and commissions at a county and at a state level, we don't know what the community wants, and it seems like it's different everywhere that we go, and that is true, and there is nuance, but there's also some core principles and core framing that communities across the country who have faced environmental degradation and harm, for that they know what they want to see in their communities, and they want to see it in an intersectional way. And so it's an invitation to either get on board, or for the EJ initiative here at NYU and other individuals and actors and folks who are in this space to be able to say, well, you have your notice, and if we decide to take other action, then we don't need to engage with you the same type of way, because you're on notice of what it's going to look like if you don't want to approach this from the community perspective. And then lastly, around that particular point, I think that it's important to work with the community and hear what the community wants. So some of the work that we're doing right now together is around a data center that is being planned to be built in PG County. Prince George's County. That's what I get for living in the DMV for too long. So Prince George's County, and that's in Maryland, and where Bernice lives. And one of the biggest concerns, particularly around this data center build out, I mean, the community has been very loud. There's been a lot of organizing around saying we don't want a data center to be built in a community where we're already facing existing pollution, where we already know we would rather, there be green spaces. We'd rather there be a focus on what the community is actually asking for, and it's not data centers. But what the county did there is they actually put in place a task force, and I put it in air quotes because there are folks who are a part of that task force who are saying that the county has kind of put them in place there so that they have a cover for what it is that they already plan to do. And so part of the strategy, what we heard from the community, is that it was important for us to actually help them to build out a report, a counter report to what we know the task force is going to come out with, which is basically, we love data centers, it's great, the community says that it's great and they want to see it. And having institutions and initiatives like what's happening here at NYU has allowed for us to be able to mobilize very quickly so that we can have a counter narrative for the strategy that they think that we're not going to be ready for, but we are going to be ready for their strategy and to be able to fight this data center in a very different way than what we're seeing, for example, in like Memphis, where they didn't have a task force at all, or in Bessemer, where I don't know what they're doing there. So we filed a public record request because nobody knows. But in Prince George's County, they're trying to take a route to make it seem as though they're engaging the community, but we're able to show a different way. And I think that that is what the future of this work needs to look like, is having folks who are doing work in policy, advocacy, mobilization, research and academia, or traditional organizers and activists, and anyone else who plays, or communications for sure, that's been a major factor in how we've been able to shift the narrative, is really by, highlighting this in the media and shaming a lot of these tech companies for what they're doing. But to have all of those components working together in an intersectional way to amplify that, we're going to put up a united front.
Thank you, Aubrey. And that intersectional piece and the role of communications, those are such important themes. I'm going to remind folks we're going to do 2 lightning rounds with a little bit more discussion up here, but then we're going to look at your index cards. So raise your hand if you got a question, and the index cards collectors will come get an index card. But before we get to the questions from the larger group, first of all, I want to tell a little story, and then we'll get to the lightning rounds. So we're going to have 2 lightning rounds, so be prepared for being pithy. These are very pithy people. But I do have a story. Aubrey was talking about how sometimes what we're up against is a communications sort of scheme to make it look like communities are in support of efforts. And some of you know one of the cases or actions that the lab has, or the EJ initiative, including the lab, which is the class that we offer, is involved in Uniontown, Alabama. And I first got involved in Uniontown more than a decade ago and started working with the community. And one of the first things I saw was members of the community sent me a videotape. And on that videotape, it showed that the county commissioner, Bernice can talk about this endlessly too, and I can talk about, during reception, we'll talk about Uniontown, Alabama. But Uniontown invited coal ash from the Kingston coal ash disaster 350 miles away to come to the county, Perry County, and I misspoke, because Uniontown didn't invite it, Perry County invited it. And what this video showed was the county commissioner who had invited this coal ash to come to this very low-income community. At the time, per capita income was under $10,000, 87% Black, in this county. And they brought 400 million tons of coal ash into a municipal solid waste facility in Uniontown. So on this video, it showed how the county commissioner who invited the coal ash to come to Uniontown, he didn't represent Uniontown, he represented the county. And by the way, the county gets something called host fees, $1 per ton. So, and the count.
We should say that the landfill is a municipal solid waste landfill. It is not a hazardous waste landfill.
That's right. That's right. And they got this money, and the money didn't go to the unincorporated area around the landfill. It went to the county, with each commissioner being able to control 1/5 of that money, including in other towns.
At $100 per ton.
$1 per ton.
$1 per ton.
$1 per ton. So, sorry, Bernice knows everything, so I hate to, but $1 per ton. But the key thing that bears on what Aubrey was saying is, on this video, they showed that investigators from the federal government, EPA, came to Perry County to say, we've heard that people in Uniontown are really roiled up about this. What about that? And the commissioner invited them to come to Marion, which is not just my name. It's the county seat, and it's not in Uniontown. And he put seats up in a room, and nobody came. And he said to EPA, see, nobody's interested. And they said, maybe we should go to Uniontown.
And they did, and the regional administrator of EPA had another public hearing, and I facilitated that public hearing. And it was all the way live, I'm just going to say that.
Yes, there was absolutely community opposition to the coal ash coming to Uniontown. But it is an example of what you're saying, Aubrey, that sometimes we're up against. I mean, misinformation is nothing new. The power of it over the internet is bringing a whole new dimension to this. But that was an example for me of the challenge. Okay, lightning round. Charles, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
The first lightning round, you have about 2 minutes, Aubrey just talked about this moment in time, and that includes an administration that's calling environmental justice illegal environmental justice. I don't know if that's a legal conclusion or just it's only illegal if it's illegal. Who knows? But we've all heard it's in, executive orders and policy documents. It's sort of like a catchphrase, illegal environmental justice. By the way, it's not illegal. Let's just be clear, it's not illegal. Okay. And if you want to look me up, we got some blogs on that. Have fun. More homework. Okay, so we're in this context where we have the president calling, and his minions calling environmental justice, which is a fight for equality and fairness, illegal environmental justice. So in that environment, how can new capacity and technical assistance, such as the Environmental Justice Initiative here, support the movements? And do you have any tangible example? We've heard about data centers, of how we can work together to lift up and support community voices.
One example would be, when during the Biden administration, one of the issues that I worked on was cumulative impacts, and cumulative impacts being really is often called the holy grail of environmental justice policy, and it represents the fact, or it speaks to the fact that there, like Bernice was talking about, environmental burdens are concentrated according to design in certain communities. And so I resolved that once I left EPA, I was going to continue working on that issue. And Marion and I, the NYU EJ initiative, helped us host a workshop on these issues. About 200 people came to 2 sessions. We highlighted all the efforts that were going on in states, and you heard about the New Jersey EJ law. There's like 7 laws that require consideration of cumulative impacts for permits at the state level, New York State being one of them under developing regulations. And then we're going to follow those up. And so that's one way I think that we can help convene and provide, you can provide legal support around these issues. A particularly important part of this, particularly now under these circumstances, is the issue of legal defensibility. Legal defensibility is something that has to be factored into how we think about strategy, how we think about our options and plans, because it is going to be part and part of everything that we do. And so I think that's clearly, one way in which the EJ initiative could help. Another would be the fact that is to think about this in a very forward-thinking way. And I would think about this like this. During the first Trump administration, a number of us worked on environmental justice at the state level. And that's because the cutting edge efforts were taking place at the state level. And what that really was all about, or what that crystallized, was in California, there was the development of a cumulative impacts mapping tool called CalEnviroScreen. And California passed a law that said that you needed to use that tool to identify to identify places where 25% of the proceeds from the greenhouse gas reduction funds would go to benefit. And so that's like targeting or prioritizing communities. That came out to be billions of dollars. And that got replicated in several other states, New York being one, Illinois another. So that became, at the beginning of the Biden administration, Justice 40, which stipulated that 40% of the benefits of a group of federal programs have to go to underserved, overburdened communities. And that was because these concepts were well developed and thought out and tested, and so there could be an initiative like that. Which, another way of asking the question is, if that had not happened, would there have been a Justice 40? So all I'm saying is, this is one example. This is a time for us to be thinking about the future in terms of what kind of things, what kind of programs, how can be implemented, how we need to think about some of these core issues, like rethinking many of the environmental laws, like the Clean Air Act, like making sure that the distribution of environmental burdens and benefits are part and parcel of the heart of environmental decision making. And we can, go on to a lot of other examples. In order to do this, this is not just an imagination, exercise. So in order to do that, we have to critique what's wrong with the system now. When Administrator Regan came up with the idea of making environmental justice part of the DNA of EPA, and I got really frustrated with that, because a lot of people were going around saying, yeah, we're putting EJ at the part of DNA, and they're all making themselves feel good by saying that, right? You cannot put new DNA into place without getting rid of the old DNA that's blocking your way. And so this is not a exercise in just thinking about the future, but it's about really taking stock of what is happening with respect to these issues, and then coming up with solutions that are actually going to work.
Thanks. Convening, strategizing, insight, representation. Lightning round, do you have anything to add?
Well, how we do legal education, right? So as I was walking over here from the hotel, walking across the park, I remembered walking across this park many a night, coming home from work at the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is where I was working when I met Marion in 1988. And there at CCR, we had a value statement and an ethos about being people's lawyers. And that ethos came from being the organization that was founded because it represented the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party as they challenged the Mississippi Democratic Party and the DNC overall for allowing segregated delegations to be sat at our national conventions that would then, formulate who would run for office, who would be president, blah, blah, blah. A lot was riding on that. But they were filled from top to bottom with segregated delegations that didn't allow Black and brown people into the rooms. And so CCR grew out of that process and represented that movement. That's Fannie Lou Hamer and so many other people who ran for Congress, right, in Mississippi. And we took that ethos, or I should say they took that ethos, because they did that in the 1960s, and built an organization around it. And the people who worked for the Center for Constitutional Rights were people who were steeped in what it meant to be a people's lawyer, what it meant to represent people who lived in really perilous circumstances, in places where their lives were threatened, for being able to speak up, or being able to say, I want to vote, or I want to participate in our democratic process, right? And so that is the ethos that we were all given about what we were called to do. And I had an incredible colleague at CCR, Margaret Carey, who's now a judge in Mississippi. And boy, we sure didn't see that coming, that one day that's what she would be doing. But she was filing these voting rights cases all over Mississippi. And I was just completely unmoored about her physical safety, that she would get in her car and she would drive all over the state, right? All over the Delta, representing these communities. And sure enough, her work eventually led to Mississippi having more Black elected officials than any other state in the United States of America, right? A fearlessness is required. An understanding of the law is required. Being able to go toe-to-toe with anyone because you know what you're talking about. You know what you're doing. You have studied this from every way and every angle. And you know that the strategy that you're pursuing is a strategy for justice grounded in the Constitution. You know that document the current administration doesn't seem to have much use for, but we have to bring life back to it, right? And so how we do legal education is really, really important in this moment in time. How we send people out into the world and what you decide to do with that could be transformative. And just know that the civil rights movement was not just people on the ground in communities challenging completely unconstitutional circumstances, but it was a whole bunch of lawyers, right? Who went, I'll tell you one short story. So we're having an event, 25th anniversary celebration of the passage of the Voting Rights Act at Tougaloo College in Mississippi. And then we had a sister event at Town Hall here in New York. And Bill Kunstler, who was one of the founders of CCR, told this story when we were in Tougaloo about how he had been asked by a law school classmate of his, the great Arthur Kanoy, constitutional law scholar and professor Arthur Kanoy, to come down and join him in doing some work, trying to figure out how could we get our hands around these cases here in Mississippi. But Bill was a divorce attorney. I don't know if you all knew that, but that was Bill's main bread and butter. He was a divorce attorney. And so his law school classmate from the class in 1937 at Columbia Law School asked him to come down to Mississippi and help him figure this out. And Bill said when he got there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing, but he figured, well, I'm going to have to stay, and I'm going to have to move to Mississippi from New York. He lived right here in the village. And he had his daughter come and go to school. She was the only white student at Tougaloo College. That's how committed he was to this work and to understanding what it meant to represent folks. And he changed his whole life. That work and the work he did in Mississippi changed the whole trajectory of his life. But he taught us at CCR what it meant to put everything on the line to represent people, right? And that is still who they are and what they do. And that's who you could be, right? I mean, you could do it anywhere. You could do it in a law firm, provided they don't capitulate, right? You could do it for a government agency. You could do it for local government. You could do it for nonprofit organizations. You could do it as an academic, right? You could do it from any vantage point, but you have to do it in this moment. You have to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll be brief. One of the, I didn't mean it like that.
She said that.
I didn't mean it like that. I'm like looking at Marion and I'm like,
looking at me and
okay,
I'm like,
2 minutes, 2 minutes. I have 2 minutes.
Questions here we're never going to get to.
I'm just trying to follow instructions. So one of the things that I think could be really important is finding ways to ensure that the community actually has the power in order to act. In the past, I think one of the, I won't say it's problems, but I think that we always felt that there was going to be a federal government that at some point we could rely on for protection for like certain things that like even at a high level that FEMA would never go back to where they were 20 years prior, that we made advancements with the National Climate Assessment, that we would at least have some kind of predictions of like weather and resiliency at some level in the future. And I think that what we're seeing now is that it is really important for institutions and for community-based groups and for the folks who have the best interests of communities to have that knowledge and to have the resources and the ownership of that information and the data and the research, so that we don't have to rely as heavily on a federal government that may sway a lot, depending on who is in office. And that's just the reality that we're in now. And so we actually worked on Power in the Storm, which was the people's focused framework, policy framework for disaster resiliency work earlier this year, to help empower communities to understand how they could ensure that they have the resources, given that, you know, the communities that are most impacted by climate issues are also the most likely to have the most severe flooding, to have the most severe wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, et cetera. And we know that that overlays, similarly to what Charles was talking about with Cal Enviro screens, with communities that are facing the most environmental hazards. And so it's about finding where those places were that we relied so heavily on the federal government in the past, and figuring out how we take back our power and ownership of that information so that we're never left in a position where a Project 2025 would ever, and I'm not saying that it has completely undone our movement, it has not, but I definitely think that we're in a place where we're kind of playing a little bit of whack-a-mole.
Yeah, this movement is never going to end.
It's never going to
It's never going to end. It won't end because of Trump.
Yeah,
Because the community is demanding
exactly.
equality.
Yeah, and we have people power. So I just want to end with that. We do have the people power, but it's about harnessing that power in a way that is united, intersectional, and then does not rely on resources that we may not have.
Thank you, Aubrey. Really important point. So you're hearing the passion, the experience, the knowledge, the lessons. So fantastic. I am going to try to push you to lightning round. So really quick, and I'll start with you, Aubrey. You can model this. I'm going to ask you to get personal here. You've all traveled extensively and worked closely with groups and communities across the country. I talked a little bit about Uniontown, which again, during reception, happy to talk about. Can you share any situation that moved you, that deepened your resolve, or that called on you in some deep way to continue working on environmental and climate justice?
Yeah, I'm actually going to go back to some work that I did right after I graduated law school in Allensworth, California. And for those who don't know, Allensworth is the oldest Black community west of the Mississippi, and definitely in California. And they had been fighting to have control of their water for the last century. And so then to, a decade and a half ago, which was many, many decades after they started that fight, to still be working with the community there around being able to control their own water, and to know that the reason that they did not control their water was because these white individuals who were supposed to sell them their systems, the infrastructure, decided to sell it to a neighboring town. And to see that, just snowball into all of the issues that they faced for decades and decades afterwards, it really highlighted for me how entrenched these issues are, and why it's so important for us to be looking at environmental justice and climate justice issues as racial justice issues.
Thank you, Aubrey. Charles?
Well, let me, I think the example of Spartanburg, South Carolina, the Regenesis Environmental Justice Partnership is a great one to lift up. This is a small area within the Arkwright, Park Grove sections of Spartanburg that was host to 2 Superfund sites, 6 brownfield sites, and decided that they wanted to move forward under the leadership of a person named Harold Mitchell to not just look at the issues in front of them, but to envision what a community would look like. and came up with a plan for wholesale community revitalization. So they started with a EPA grant, environmental justice small grant of $20,000, and leveraged it into over $300 million of public-private partnership resources. They have a health system now. They have new transportation thoroughfares. They have economic development, a Hope 6 housing project. They're developing a solar farm, and so on and so forth. So that, for me, is really important, because that's what I use as a model for developing this environmental justice collaborative problem-solving model that EPA framed its grants around. And that same kind of approach not only informed a set of grants going back to the early 2000s, but the billions of dollars of grants that we gave out under the Biden administration.
Thanks so much, Charles. Inspiring. Bernice.
Interestingly enough, I would say a place called Rock Hill, South Carolina. So the state of South Carolina, because of the success of the work in Spartanburg, had a whole process of community engagement to help them figure out what brownfields redevelopment could look like across the state of South Carolina. And so we helped to facilitate a bunch of dialogues there, and we moved that conversation around the state. And one of those meetings was in a place called Rock Hill, South Carolina. And Rock Hill, South Carolina, the name Rock Hill comes from the fact that the city is really sort of sitting on a plateau of granite. And it's just very rocky, but really like miles and miles and miles down. So the Black community sits in one of these plateaus, and they have no running water and no sanitary sewage systems. And I'm not talking about work that I did 30 years ago. I'm talking about work that I did 7 years ago. And that made me start looking at the issue of wastewater infrastructure and lack thereof. And I found hundreds of communities in the United States, hundreds of them, many of them communities of color, but not all, that to this day do not have access to clean, potable drinking water and sanitary sewage systems. And that put a fire under me around a whole different set of issues. And so one of the things that I wanted the most from the Biden-Harris administration, and they certainly were on a trajectory to deliver this from the Office of Water at EPA, was to just find all these places and make them whole. That as a modern society, shouldn't everybody in the United States have access to running water and sanitary sewage systems? So I'll end with this lightning round. There's a community in Alabama. What community am I talking about? She was on the WeJat. Catherine's community. What's the name of the community? Lowndes County, Alabama, right? Also in the Black Belt. And people should know, whenever people talk about the Black Belt of Alabama, they think they're talking about Black people. They're actually talking about the soil and how rich the soil in this part of Alabama was. And so they had been working for decades to get sanitary sewage systems in their community. And they were not successful. So finally, Marion, I'm gonna tell this work because maybe she's still not far enough out of government service that she can talk about it, but on behalf of EPA, she took to the Justice Department a case to make sure that the state of South Carolina would stop bypassing them with federal water infrastructure money and bring this to them. So they're gonna get their water system. Finally, after decades and decades, wait. And then the lovely current president signs an executive order that says that is evidence of waste, fraud, and abuse and DEI, which is so evil. So we're going to take that money back and not give them that water infrastructure. So how many people know what hookworm is? So I thought that we had eliminated hookworm in the United States, right? So those are people who are exposed to raw sewage. But the children in Lowndes County, because they do straight piping, do y'all know what straight piping is? So straight piping are PVC pipes that you'll see running out of people's houses, many in rural communities. And you probably think when you see it, that those pipes are connected to a septic system or some kind of municipal sewage system. But no, they're just straight pipes that bring the sewage and the wastewater right out of their homes, and they go into a pit or the backyard or whatever. And when it rains, the kids are playing in all of this. And so in Lowndes County, kids are still developing hookworm. If ever there was a place that EPA needed to invest, it was certainly Lowndes County, Alabama. So just so you know what we're up against, right? Even drinking water and wastewater systems are thought to be waste, fraud, and abuse. So when Abray talks about the need to change the narrative, whenever you hear this crazy stuff, you got to call it out for what it is, right? You got to challenge this. You got to say, this is just not accurate. And then give another side of the story. At least call the people who are talking trash. Just call them out for the liars that they are. Because this is just kind of getting insane.
Thank you, Bernice. I cannot take credit for that case. Lowndes County, I was recused when I got to the federal government because I had worked on that case when I was at Earth Justice. And so I was recused from Lowndes County. So I just want to be clear on the record. I did not work on that case.
So she might not have worked on that case, but you better believe that she put the pressure on people to do the right thing, okay? She didn't work on the case.
On that case.
But she just let us all know, y'all better do something and make those people whole.
And Uniontown is 2 counties over. I want to tell you that the problems are incumbent. But thank you, Bernice. And you actually, let me just take one question from the group. If you can raise your hand. I want to encourage, there's a question over here. He was first, so I'm going to take that question. We're almost out of time. I want to say that Bernice had already touched on one of the questions in here. But the questions I got were great questions. Please accost us during the reception. We're happy to talk to you. But before I get to your question, there's one question that you sort of addressed. It's really a communications question. And we're only going to have time for one person to give a quick answer, which is the federal government swiftly got rid of DEIA and EJ as terms, as I said, illegal EJ, whatever that means. Does the panel think that the movement should change the wording or the terms? Very quickly. Charles, you got it.
No, we act for environment.
No.
So we act for environmental justice has done some polling work, and they found that the issues related to environmental justice poll like in the really high in terms of support, public support, like in the 80th percentile range. And so, you know, it's important that we continue to keep to those issues. This is not about like moving away from the term, it's digging in further into the term to really figure out how to communicate around this. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this, and one of the things that I think we all learned, and it has been proven to be really effective as part of the environmental justice movement, is to link data with personal narratives, the stories of communities. And you know, we can have a whole conversation around that, but this is the lightning round.
And it's also important to know that DEI and environmental justice are not the same thing, are not connected, are not related, and are not pursued on the same trajectory at all. The two things have nothing to do with each other. We are not trying to get more people of color poisoned. That's not what we're trying to do here, okay? And that would be the extrapolation of DEI onto environmental justice, right? That is not what we're trying to do. But just a show of hands. In the DEI universe, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we've moved federal policy, state policy, local policy on that, what group of people have benefited the most from diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and practices over the last 40 years? What group of people? Rebecca? White women. By and far, by and large, by orders of magnitude, the rest of us are not even in the game in terms of how white women have benefited. We ain't mad at you. We are not mad at you. We're just saying that, you know, let's call it for what it is. It's about opportunity. Women were not getting opportunity in the workplace to be able to buy a home, to be able to have their own credit, to do whatever anybody else could do. We were not able to do it. right? So when they come for DEI, y'all need to raise your hands and say, hey, you're coming for me. But y'all have been really, really, really quiet, and I need you to get up in the game because this is about your future, right? I'm just saying.
Thank you, Bernice. One question,
Well,
name and question only, because we're standing between people and their wine.
yeah, so Yamardu here, and this would dovetail your commentary here. So how best might we make the case that capitulation in advance is a fool's errand, because whatever you do, sooner or later they'll find some pretense to attack you. So how we make it clear that there's no way you're going to get ahead by capitulating in advance, that you just have to stick to it? What's the best case?
Aubrey, quick.
Okay.
I
No
chose
pressure.
Aubrey because she's quickest.
Okay. So I think that it's really about helping people, kind of what's been said before, is helping people to understand that the people most impacted actually do care about those terms. And I think that in a moment right now where their goal is to try to have us retreat, that is important for us to show a strong united front of the things that we've been fighting for decades and for centuries. And that if we take this time to actually say, okay, well, we have an administration that's saying that we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't do that, then they're just going to continue to move the needle further and further away. And so when we show that we have a strong united front, and we show the data, and we show that our communities actually do use these terms, then that only helps us for future conversations. And one thing I didn't add really quickly, we're coming up on a midterm election year as well. And that's also an important time for us to double down on our narratives and to make sure that individuals who we feel are going to be most helpful to the next steps of environmental and climate justice, that they're also doubling down on the narratives and the framework that we find to be important as well.
Thank you, Aubrey. Before I thank folks and close out, I also want to just add on the water issue. During the Biden administration, one of the places that we did a lot of work on water issues, and the straight pipes were just reminding me of that, is West Virginia, which is low-income white communities that from the very beginning, environmental and climate justice have not been racialized. They have been about fairness and opportunity and clean air, clean water for everyone, without regard to race, color, national origin, and other factors. The fact is that the reality is that correlation, that association between race and where polluting facilities are located, between race and exposure to pollution. And so where it's incumbent on us to overcome that reality, to address that reality. And we have to be aware of that reality in order to address it. So it's West Virginia as well as Lowndes County and Uniontown. So this has been an incredible conversation. So first of all, many thanks to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. I know we could applause forever, but we do want to talk over drinks. Deep appreciation also to everyone who helped make this evening a possibility. And I've already thanked the Napolis and Vincent and Katrina and the Dean. I want to thank the Krill and Guarini Center staff, particularly David Peer and Kyla James, who did all of the logistical work, and I just want to thank them. I want to thank our fellows, Juna and Nate and Shella. Thank you so much. Security, I mean, there's so many people. Christine, Billy, where's Christine? Christine and Patrice. Patrice just joined NYU at the School of Law as the executive director of Krill, and Christine is the executive director of Guarini. Without them, this would not have been possible. And everyone throughout NYU who helped make this event a success. So now I want to thank you and invite you to the reception at the Faculty Club, which is right across in the next room, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you so much.